I'd like to say right at the beginning of the show that the opinions and ideas expressed on this show are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. Thank you for joining me today. You know, I was talking about propaganda last week, but there's just so much to say about propaganda and how it works and what it looks like when we stumble across it in the news that I've just got to go there again today with a whole different set of stories. You know, there's this tactic among the mainstream media and those in the broadcasting board of governors and among the chattering class of talking heads that is to discredit any alternative news source that gets too popular or that might contradict a mainstream narrative. Well, you know, one of the big stories that they're pretending to deliver in the U.S. So alternate sources that get too popular, these have to be eliminated. Any competing ideas, especially from overseas, well, it's not too big a deal if they're from overseas, because after all, who in America reads Der Spiegel? Who in America reads The Guardian, which used to be a good newspaper, or The Independent, or The Australian, or any of the other news services? Not too many folk. So if you can just silence the dissent from any major players here, generally they've got a pretty open field to deliver talking points of power. And generally this is done with minimal, if any, investigation on their own part. Too often, you know, we find that they're happy to make up news or just ignore it when it suits them. And there's a name for this mechanism of ignoring news and focusing on non-stories. It's called the dig here, not there strategy. So the news will go out of their way to find stories that outrage you in very safe ways, you know, innocent people being killed, horrendous murders. They'll go out of their way to find scandals that involve no one important, not scandals in government or in banking or in any of the big corporations. Heavens, no. You know, scandals of ordinary people. These are safe. They cover celebrities. These are safe. It doesn't offend anybody in power when they cover these stories. But it also eats up news ticks. It eats up time when they could actually cover real stories and actually present real news, but they don't. I consider this fluid reality of the people who work in the mainstream news, who plainly know that this is in fact what they're doing, unless they are just dyed-in-the-wool, washed in the blood ideologues of power and of the general outlook of the structures of power. They surely know. But this fluid reality, you know, perhaps influences people like Brian Williams, who got caught elaborating his personal war story in Iraq with tales of fabricated daring do and tales of threats he never actually had to face. When one lives for such a long time in lies, small embellishments may actually be second nature for these people. But why should we believe anything the MSM or the government say about issues that they have lied about forever? They've lied about every war that we've entered. They've lied about all of the opponents that we faced. They have lied about who our allies and friends are. They have lied about the conduct of war, the length of war, the methods by which war will be fought. So, on the one hand, why should we believe anything at all that they say? It's really no surprise that so many people run to what I like to refer to as alternative narratives. Some folks call these conspiracy theories, but alternative narratives is a less pejorative, a less judgmental expression. But very often these conspiracy theories, so-called, actually fit the evidence or examine evidence that has been ignored or not properly dealt with by the mainstream media. So currently we've got one popping up. It's called Operation Jade Helm, which is being run by the United States Army, and it's going to happen fairly shortly. It's a widespread operation over several states in the southwest United States, involving a variety of troops who are training not just in combat, but also in infiltration, also in blending in with populations, these kinds of things. And this has the Alex Jones types absolutely convinced that this is, if not training for, possibly maybe even the actual operation to begin a military takeover of the United States. You know how breathless Alex gets about this stuff. Thumps his chest, gets real loud. So, the conspiracy folks look at this and go, well, this plausibly looks like training for, if not the actual operation, to attack a number of right-wing groups in the southeast of the United States. Now, the Army Times, the Stars and Stripes, the Washington Post, a lot of folks have come out and said, this is no. This is not a sinister attempt. There have actually been operations like this before that did not result in masses of people being arrested and interrogated. It didn't do that. But it's not going to stop some people from thinking this could be, in fact, the case, because they have such a profound distrust of their government and of everything that their government says in the mainstream media. And it's not the fault of the people that they have this distrust. It's the fault of the media and the fault of the government, who have failed dismally in their responsibility, if not their duty, to inform the people of their affairs instead of lying to them. And regarding this Operation Jade Helm 15, I'm beginning to wonder if it would be such a bad idea to round up some of these folks in the Southwest, given the shenanigans at Bundy Ranch, when all those wannabe militia types came out with their guns ready to shoot the BLM for enforcing the law, and to stop Cliven Bundy and his family from defrauding the United States government, or given the shenanigans down in, I believe it's Arizona, where a bunch of oath takers are rushing there to protect a miner from a BLM dispute over the actual title of his, what the title of his holding is. So run down there with guns and stop the BLM because this is a government takeover and we're going to stand them down with weapons. They played that game at Cliven Bundy's ranch. They're not going to get away with it forever, I will guarantee you. And there is, however, such a sheer number of crazy people, especially in Texas, who have lots and lots of guns, and crazy militias and wannabe armies and people who feel all kinds of wrongs who are carrying weapons. Consider the Waco case, which was a grotesque overreaction by Janet Reno and the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the other agencies involved. But the funny bit about Waco and David Koresh and the Branch Davidians is in an interview with a local editor of a newspaper, he revealed that the journalists in the newsroom, had a pool about which of the local compounds would be the first one to go ballistic. And he said the Branch Davidians weren't even in the top 10. So it gives you a sense of what places like some parts of Texas may in fact be like. It's not like it's difficult to find real stories. There are enough real stories of lies and cover-ups and wrongdoing that you really don't even have to search for them. They just kind of fall into your lap. One is the case of another NBC stalwart, Richard Engel, who was kidnapped in Syria in 2012 and was subsequently released. Well, the story at the time was he was kidnapped by forces affiliated with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, and they were holding him and his crew for who knows what reason, and then they were freed by the Free Syrian Army or some element of them and allowed to go on their merry way, talking about the blessings of the Free Syrian Army as noble allies and Assad as the evil person. But from the get-go, people knowledgeable of the area, knowledgeable of Arabic, who were reading the graffiti on the walls, people who know the players in the region, people like the folks who write for Moon of Alabama, or people like Professor Asad Abu Khalil, who publishes under the pseudonym Angry Arab, were raising doubts about this from the get-go. And now, quoting Moon of Alabama, there's now new evidence that this was indeed a fake event, that whatever Richard Engel may believe, he and the people with him, including one ever unnamed British engineer, who is more likely some special operations guy, were not in the hands of Shabiha, but in the hand of a well-known, experienced video faker. Now, this is interesting. So we have Engel and his team smuggled into Syria, we don't know by whom. We have people who interview him after he is miraculously released. Who knew about that? We have the changing stories, not just from Mr. Engel, but also from NBC itself, who keep managing to discover new information about the case. But it was clearly fake. The entire bit was clearly fake. And as Moon of Alabama point out, this points to a bigger plot. This points to a larger conspiracy, if you will, to have this engineered kidnapping of a journalist team, have them held, have them miraculously released, more on that in a minute, and then have the story come out about how, all the good that our noble allies are doing over there. But Engel had said he had seen dead people. Now he's saying he hadn't seen them at all. In his Vanity Fair article, Brian Engel described one of his captors lying dead. In a statement given just recently, he acknowledged that he did not see any bodies during the rescue. He even still speaks of dead kidnappers and a firefight during which he was rescued. But there's at least one local eyewitness to the event, Tahir al-Shaib, a local man connected with the rebel movement who sought the NBC team, who said, quote, "We heard some random shots for less than a minute coming from the direction of the farm." And he said that Abu Ayyam, the rebel commander credited with freeing the team, is directly related by marriage to Mr. Ajou, and that he staged the rescue. And even Engel doesn't say exactly how he was really rescued and how he immediately came to be stuck in front of a video camera with the Moon of Alabama's words, news faker Khaled Abu Saleh. So Engel really has to come clean on this point. But so do the New York Times, and so do the Huffington Post, who as MOA write, should have dug out the backstory. The backstory would reveal that Western secret services, quoting now, with the help of para-government organizations like Avaz and some paid Syrian revolutionaries, created false stories and videos about the bad Assad regime. That backstory would explain that Western journalists from outlets like NBC and New York Times including the writer of a piece on NBC called C.J. Shivers, and HuffPo willingly took part in and propagandized those scams when they were known to be quite obvious lies. So here we have major news sources running stories that anybody with a few minutes of thought, anybody who would talk to anyone who knows anything about the area or the languages or the players would see through, either can't be bothered to do real news or just likes the story so much because it sings the song of power. It's a small story, sure. The one about Brian Engel, it's a small story. It's a lie told by a journalist who should have known better. Yet there's a problem here. It undermines our trust in media, such as it is. It underlies our trust in the mainstream media. It does raise the question, what else are they lying about or getting wrong or simply not covering? But most dangerously, most alarmingly, the Engels case and other cases like it, and I've got more of them coming for you, the Engels case is often a case for war. So we have these eyewitnesses, we have these daring accounts of kidnap and rescue. We have tales of truly evil people and truly good people trying to help. Fairy tales, Disney stories, childhood tales for your kids in bed. Nothing to do with the real world. But when mainstream journalists play these games, either through incompetence and stupidity or through collusion with power, what credibility do they have, and why should we listen to a damned word they say? Why indeed? But look what we get. We get lots of stories that don't upset power. They simply fill the news with innocuous drivel. Celebrity stories. Who cares? Gaffes of politicians. Oh, did she really say that? Ha, 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 what a goober. It doesn't mean anything. And then we have the upsetting social stories, right, that fill us with outrage or sorrow. And this is, from the standpoint of media, good news, meaning it's news that sells eyeballs. It puts butts on seats, as they used to say. It sells eye time. People look at these. People repost these on Facebook. People will talk about these. Did you hear about that awful, horrible, and there's lots of awful, horrible, to talk about. There's black men being gunned down by police at epidemic rates in this country. There are poor people having their lives stolen from them. These are all real stories, and they're important stories. But in focusing on individual incidents, you notice they never dig into the structural issues behind the story. Why have police in so many parts of this country become militarized and trigger happy? There's a story for you. Why are poor people having such a hard time just getting through the day, finding food, finding housing? There's a story for you, but that's a difficult story. That's a structural story. That's a story that would take some explanation and some background. And you can't do that in a 2-minute segment. And you can't do that in a couple of column inches. So they don't cover the story, and they pat themselves on the back and feel good. Now, this is what news programs, extended news programs, were supposed to do. You know, these hour-long current affairs shows. This is what they were supposed to do. And sometimes they do, in fact, dig in deep to a story. But often they don't. Often they don't. They'll follow a little non-story, or they'll give it a gentle twist. Will you ever see a story on American television on one of the Sunday shows or 60 Minutes or anything like this examining U.S. propaganda? Examining the real causes of poverty and homelessness, examining the real causes of environmental degradation, examining why Cantwell is apparently the only person I've heard in power actually talking about trying to do something about these rolling bombs in DOT 3 cars filled with exploding fracked oil and oil sands oil, which roll through Spokane by the hundreds every day. Lac Magnetique. Think what happened there. Well, this is not a story. I mean, you'd have to get into the details of how oil companies are so criminal and so focused on the pursuit of their own profits that they can't be bothered to take a little care to get better rail cars, to not ship this damned oil. And they talk about building a new shipping port now over in Anacortes, so they can ship even more of the oil from BC and from the Bakken fields. Hey, newsflash, people, this oil is going to be gone in 5 years. The Bakken field will be largely dead in 5 years. A growing number of geologists say that the estimates for the field were way, way, way too high. And already the field, the really productive areas of the field are starting to decline, and the poorer areas of the field will never produce that much. But hey, let's risk everything. Let's risk the lives of hundreds of thousands of people rolling this stuff through urban areas right across the country. But that's not a story. That's not a story. If you told that story, you might upset somebody rich, somebody powerful. So it doesn't get told. And then we have the good old shaggy dog stories, plucky lad saves dog from drowning, or dog saves plucky lad from drowning, this kind of stuff. And when all else fails, you can always just put on kittens, like John Oliver did on his piece about the end of the world. And as we close, here's a picture of kittens in a bar, playing piano and drinking beer. He nailed that one. He really does. Anyway, dig here, not there. Write stories that don't upset power. Simply fill the news with more innocuous drivel, outrage, things that we can feel superior to other people for having watched. What is a story that should be covered? One that speaks to the wave of lies and deceptions and false flag operations and misconduct on a grand scale. Those are the stories that really need covering. And golly gosh, I've got one here for you. Do you remember back in 2001? And right after 9/11, there was this enormous number of grand tactics used to advance this neoconservative agenda and strategy for global war. And it began with 9/11. That wasn't the beginning of the strategy. That started somewhat earlier and was published in 1999. But the neocon agenda and strategy for global war began to roll out after 9/11 without people asking many questions about it. Remember the anthrax? Do you remember the anthrax incidents, plural? Do you remember that within a day or two of the 9/11, White House officials were taking the antibiotic Cipro just in case? Why? Was there some report about anthrax? No. Was there some imminent threat of anthrax? Not one that was ever made public. This was before any of the anthrax attacks occurred. But 7 days after 9/11, we did have anthrax attacks. Right? We did have anthrax attacks. This is interesting. We had anthrax attacks around Washington and New York. And then a week later, 2 U.S. senators, Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy, received letters confirmed with anthrax in them. Tom Brokaw on NBC got their letters a week earlier, and the National Enquirer in Florida got theirs a couple of weeks later. So it's October 9 that Daschle and Leahy get their letters. 2 U.S. senators. How do you drive home the importance of an imminent threat other than poison to senators, or attempt to? Now, here's the kicker, before you think I'm completely crazy. There was an FBI agent in charge of this entire operation. His name is Richard Lambert. Richard Lambert filed a suit on the 2nd of April, 2015, alleging that the entire FBI investigation was a sham. A sham. The chief FBI investigator says that the entire investigation was a sham. Now, wait a minute. We've got anthrax used against U.S. senators, against journalists, and not just any old anthrax, mind you. Not just some kind of cheap stuff that Saddam Hussein could have cooked up in the 1980s with the cultures that we sold him, and with the equipment that we and the British provided him. And most of the anthrax and botulinum that we sold to Saddam, as I understand it, came from a company called Virginia Tissue and Culture. I'm sure somebody still has the receipts for those. But he had no anthrax at the time of 9/11. Everybody agreed on that, except the people for whom truth and reality don't matter. I'll get to them in a minute. So anyway, here we have the FBI agent filing a whistleblower complaint. A whistleblower complaint saying that his efforts to advance the case met with intransigence from the local office, from the field office, the Washington field office. Executive management, apathy and error from the FBI laboratory, politically motivated communication embargoes from FBI headquarters, and yet another preceding and equally erroneous legal opinion from Kelly et al., all of which greatly obstructed and impeded the investigation. Greatly obstructed and impeded the investigation. My God, you think you'd get people on the hump to try and get that right? You think this person would have had the very best researchers, the very best field agents? Nope. They gave him new field agents straight out of school. They refused to provide timely and adequate scientific analyses and forensic examinations. They refused to process information that he found. They hounded 2 people, one of whom collected some millions of dollars for slander after beating them down, while the other one, a Mr. Ivins, ended up rather mysteriously dead, and there was no autopsy in that case. But while they were hounding Ivins, the report, the lawsuit says, there was exculpatory evidence that was hidden from the public and from the FBI. Handwriting analyses that failed to link the anthrax letters known to known writing samples from Ivins. No textile fibers matched anything on Ivins. No pens matched the ink used to address the envelopes. Samples of his hair failed to match hair samples found in the mailbox used to mail the letters. No souvenirs of the crime were found. The FBI could not place Ivins at the crime scene with evidence. And Ivins, one of the things I thought was suspicious is he was putting in late nights at the lab. He started putting in late nights at the lab in August 2001, weeks before the attacks. The FBI didn't even want to test the DNA sample found on the anthrax letter to Senator Leahy. stopped searching. After locking on Ivins, the Bureau stopped searching for the match. We got our guy. No need to look for the person who may belong to this DNA. And on and on and on. Now here's the real kicker, though, about this entire story. And this is the very disturbing part. The anthrax that was used in the anthrax attacks was not just old garden variety anthrax. Oh, no, 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 no. This was weaponized anthrax. It was designed to disperse easily into the air in very tiny particles and to stay suspended in the air. Not to fall back to the ground as dust, not to stick to the walls, just stay suspended in the air and float around where people could breathe it and so become infected. This is not something you can make in your bathroom. This requires very special equipment, very special expertise, and there are really only a handful of labs in the world that can probably do this. A couple of them are in the United States, and they're run by the Army, by the U.S. government. Other curious thing about this strain of anthrax is you can look at the genetic makeup of various strains of anthrax, because there aren't that many around, and certainly not in weaponized forms. So if we look at the weaponized anthrax, the analysis proved that it was of the Ames strain. And that refers to the Ames testing laboratory in Iowa, where the U.S. government plays with such things as aerosolizing anthrax. Not because we want to use it as a biological weapon, understand, but because we need to know how to defend ourselves. Well, you think about a facility like that, which is probably a level 4 facility. Nobody goes in or out without airproof suits and multiple washes and all this stuff, you know. And here you've got a guy with no access to that lab, no clearance to that lab, who's alleged to have somehow magically gotten his hands onto this weaponized Ames anthrax. Seriously? Seriously? There is a small number of people who could conceivably have had access to that lab. Ivins wasn't one of them. And the FBI knew this, and yet they pursued him anyway, because the first guy didn't pan out. So they had to find another fall guy. Oh, find a guy who actually works with anthrax, but he didn't work at Ames. And he had no access to that lab. According to Richard Spertzel, who also says Ivins didn't do it, he says only 4 or 5 people in the entire country knew how to make anthrax of the quality used in those letters. And he said, Spertzel said, and I'm one of them. And he said it would take him a year with a full lab and a staff of helpers to do it. But the FBI says that Ivins did it alone, working a few nights. Killer anthrax contained silicon, but the anthrax that Ivins was working on in another lab did not. The FBI said the silicon was absorbed from surroundings, but Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories debunked that theory. Silicon was intentionally added to make the killer anthrax more potent. Ivins and Fort Detrick did not have that capability, but other labs did. So, what does the FBI do? What they don't do is pursue the case. What they do is set up a series of fall guys. They go after one person, and then when that doesn't pan out, they go after Ivins. Now, why? Why is the question. A senior FBI official said that the FBI was actually told to blame the anthrax attacks on Al-Qaeda by White House officials. Government officials also said that the White House tried to link anthrax to Iraq as a justification for war. So the war on terror, the Iraq war, all that nonsense in Afghanistan and the Middle East, were to some extent supported by this idea that we had been attacked. The United States had been attacked. And these letters certainly helped Congress rush through the Patriot Act, which was passed 45 days after 9/11. This thing was sitting on a shelf somewhere. Somebody came into a terrified Congress and said, "You got to vote. We got to be able to do this now." And Congress did. Very few people even read it. And it is odd that the only Congress people who received the anthrax letters, the only two who received them, were the ones likely to vote against the Patriot Act. Now, isn't that curious? That's just so very strange. Heavens. A government agency covering up serious wrongdoing in the support of nefarious agendas? How could that happen, and why? Now I'm going to make some of my listeners really uncomfortable here, and if you're just joining, I'm discussing today how media and power, media are manipulated by power, sometimes willingly, to serve power, and that many of the great problems that we face, the eternal wars, the complete destruction of the Middle East, the loss of our civil rights, are directly traceable to events reported by media and never really examined in any depth. So this is going to freak some people out, but I'm going to go here. There's much that remains unresolved about 9/11 and what some would call errant data. Errant data, these are indisputable facts, true things, which are not disputed, but they don't fit the official stories and they can't be explained away with the official stories. Things like molten metal in the basement of WTC 1 and 2. Things like firemen reporting explosions from underneath them. Things like Building 7 or any of the buildings collapsing into their own footprint. And yes, I have read the NIST study, the National Institutes of Standard and Testing, and I'm not an engineer, but there are engineers. There's some thousands of engineers who are members of a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. These are professionals. These are not crazy people. These are professional engineers and architects who maintain that the events as described did not happen as described. It is physically impossible. NIST says otherwise, but they have attacked the NIST report as well. Now, the predictable response that happens, the predictable response that one encounters, is that when you mention something like this, the watchdogs of power start growling and twitching their ears and start, like an old dog trying to get up on their feet. And then begins the ridicule and character assassination that are appended to the labeling of the source of a conspiracy theory. I still prefer alternative narratives. So, even powerful intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky eschew anything about 9/11, the conflicting data, conflicting reports, events, testimonies from experts. You just can't go there. It is so, the waters have been so poisoned that you can't return to them easily without having people just ignore you. The truth has been closed on that. If you don't believe me, read the 9/11 report. A report so deeply flawed that the two people who led the committee wouldn't sign it and said, this is a deeply flawed report. Or simple facts that came out of 9/11. The well-documented fact of a pilot so incompetent he could not fly a Cessna 150, Mr. Hanjour, who nonetheless, a few weeks later, performs this act of excellent flying of a jet, a big jet, that he'd never flown before, following a very complex flight path and not the easiest flight path to take if you really wanted to do damage to the building. You wouldn't have flown low and crashed into the side of it. You would have come down hard and hit the roof. It'd give you a much bigger area and a much easier target to hit. But somehow, this guy who couldn't fly a Cessna 150 pulls off this complex flight pattern and hits the Pentagon. I am still waiting for an explanation of what happened with that, because the official one is nonsensical. It is nonsensical, as is saying that jet fuel melted steel girders. It is nonsensical, as is saying that buildings collapsed into their own footprint symmetrically. It is nonsensical. I'm still waiting for explanations. I'm not convinced by NIST, but NIST has issued, so I must shut up and cease questioning these kinds of things. So, just stay with me a minute. Let's be a little crazy. Who benefits? Who benefits from 9/11 and the anthrax attacks? Both of which were quickly covered up. The investigations were carefully managed, evidence destroyed, witnesses ignored, testimony redacted. Who benefited? Oh, well, there was this group of people. I told you I'd get back to them. The neoconservatives, who had a thing called Program for a New American Century. And these were people like Robert Kagan, who's now with one of the big conservative think tanks, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, William Kristol. And they formed a little group and issued a report back in 1999 called Rebuilding America's Defenses that said a Pearl Harbor-like event would be required to bring the country to accept the plans for global expansion of military actions that these guys were proposing. It would take a Pearl Harbor-like event. So when the authors of this document achieved power, just a very few years after 1999, the U.S. got its Pearl Harbor event, and the neocons got Afghanistan, Iraq, and by extension, wars throughout the Middle East. It was very fortuitous for their plans. So am I saying they did it? I have no evidence. I have none at all. I am simply asking the question, who benefits? Defense contractors benefited. The Koch brothers benefited. The Koch brothers' son-in-law, David Prince, benefited, the guy who runs Blackwater. And this is all just conspiracy, just craziness, just really, nothing going on here at all. Nothing to see here, folks. Just keep going. Move along now. Move along. Nothing to see. So, the world these neocons made, my goodness. It is an interesting world that these neocons made. And such was the title of a piece published in Russia Insider by David William Pear. He's quoting Paul Wolfowitz, who was, you recall, the Underdefense Secretary for Policy for George H.W. Bush and later served under George Bush's regime. Quote, "Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival. By convincing potential competitors, notice not enemies, competitors, that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. We must maintain the mechanism for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role." So recognizing these people have legitimate interests and might be rivals and competitors, not enemies, but competitors, we must devise some way of stopping them from trying to become competitors. So this group actually wrote a letter in 1998 to Clinton, urging Clinton to invade Iraq. Well, Clinton's response was to sign the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998 that subsequent President George Bush could use as an authorization to invade Iraq. with a little tweaking. Neocons. So what happens? You got to understand how these people are. I mean, they're chicken hawks. Almost every one of them was a chicken hawk. Vietnam avoider, W. Cheney. I mean, the whole lot of them. So when they get caught out, when their plans go south, when everything they said would happen turns out to be completely wrong or a complete lie from the get-go, what happens? They say things like, superpowers don't get to retire. Kagan, writing for the Brookings Institute, said, back in 2014, said he feared that American people were becoming isolationist. He was concerned that a war-tired America would turn away from the neoconservative vision of controlling the world. Long wars and empire building. He had no shame about Iraq. Kagan said that only an empire can bring peace and enlightenment to the world, just like he said the Roman Empire had done. And, of course, the only place that can do it is the United States because of our moral exceptionalism, which we see demonstrated daily on our own streets and overseas. Here's a direct quote from Kagan's book, which was repeated by Obama in his 2012 State of the Union address. America is a moral example, and she remains that one indispensable nation. And anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. Now, the author also points out that Obama is a big fan of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security director, who masterminded the covert war in Afghanistan in the 80s. And when he was when Brzezinski was questioned about the rise of radical Islamic fundamentalism that he helped create and fund and train, he said in 1998, quote, that stirred up Muslims was nothing to worry about. Some stirred up Muslims was nothing to worry about. Well, my goodness. Now, you know, if the newspapers had done their jobs, we likely could have avoided some of these wars, don't you think? We likely could have avoided the loss of treasure and blood that we and other countries have shed, particularly in the Middle East. You recall I was citing the numbers of likely Muslim casualties as direct and indirect outcomes of U.S. actions, somewhere in the 4 to 6 million range. 4 to 6 million dead. The Iraqi government slipped up the other day and accidentally announced that there were 5 million Iraqi orphans who weren't there before the war started. So there's a big chunk there. And there is a group, Iraqi Body Count, who track bodies, literally, in Iraq. But because they literally track bodies, their counts are way, way, way low. And it doesn't help their credibility that they receive money from the U.S. government, who has a vested interest in keeping the body count, civilian body count, as low as possible. While, meanwhile, you have the Lancet study, you have other studies that put that using accepted methodological instruments extrapolate numbers. They come up with much, much higher figures than Iraqi body count. But Iraqi body count, and who's counting bodies anyway? And the truly sad thing, is because of these lies, we've engaged in wars that were not wars of defense, but wars of aggression. And these continue to destabilize the entire Middle East. You hear about all those people drowning in the Mediterranean, the 700 or 900 who drowned when their boats went down. There's boat after boat fleeing Africa. They're not fleeing for the fun of it. They're fleeing because the whole of their countries has been turned into stinking, smoking death traps, courtesy of us. Libya, Iraq, Yemen. The list goes on and on and on. We are the gift that won't stop giving. So we bring death and destructions to millions of innocents. And we destroy not just whole countries. I mean, think about it. We destroyed Iraq and Afghanistan. They are gone as functioning countries. Iraq in particular. But we destroy not only countries, we destroy civilizations. Much older than our own. And Tom Cotton and people like that who talk about wanting to go bomb Iran. Oh, what shallow, worthless souls. But here's the deal. When you've got a good ideology, facts don't matter. If you're a neocon, the ideology is American exceptionalism, militarism, imperialism, global domination, and any facts that get in the way of that don't matter. Didn't work here, try it there. Didn't work here, try it there. Didn't work here, try it there. You know, you look at the actions of these people, and when I do, I can only conclude that they are without morals, that they are without ethics, and they're without loyalty to anyone but themselves. I mean, look at the gaggle of Republicans who stood up in the Congress and said they would take Israel's lead against their own country. To whom then are they loyal? That sounds like traitors to me. Imagine if Democrats had done that. Traitors. They're devoid of love. They're devoid of compassion. They're devoid of humanity, if any of these lie in the way of their agendas. And there is no number of people too great to kill for a pack of lies. The same group of neocons and their buddies continue to direct U.S. policy and military activities around the world. Robert Kagan, the Brookings Institute, married to Victoria Nuland, U.S. State Department representative to Europe, a key player in the destabilization of Ukraine, and the lies about Ukraine and Maidan continue to percolate freely as if they were the truth. So we look at the new news. Saudi Arabia commits ground troops for rebuilding in Yemen after bombing civilian targets for a week. CBS, our CBS, called the Houthi an Iranian proxy army, and yet Iran had attempted to dissuade them from seizing the capital of Sana'a, saying it would be a very bad idea. Saudi Arabia wants to reinstate their dictator and have a friendly proxy government on their border. But there will be no democracy in Yemen. There will be as much democracy in Yemen as there is in Saudi Arabia, which is none. But that won't stop us from supporting this. Let them have their friendly proxy, totalitarian, authoritarian, anti-democratic government, because that's better than the alternative, which might be, I don't know, self-governance by the people. Oh, wait, that would be a serious threat to Saudi Arabia. And then we have this transformation of Eurasia. As a number of people are beginning to note, the idea of Eurasia, the old Eurasia in its old form, the form that Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote about, the grand chessboard, which was just an extension of McKittrick's idea of the great game, it's over. Pepe Escobar, I'll give him the last word. Pepe Escobar, writing for the Asia Times, says, quote, "So what we have here is the makings of a greater Asia, from Shanghai to St. Petersburg, including, crucially, Tehran. Instead of a total Eurasia, that extends from Lisbon to Vladivostok, total Eurasia may be broken, at least for now, but Greater Asia is a go. There will be a tsunami of efforts by the usual suspects to break it up. All this will be fascinating to watch. How will Moscow and Beijing stare down the West, politically, commercially, and ideologically, without risking a war? How will they cope with so much pressure? How will they sell their strategy to great swaths of the global South across multiple Asian latitudes? One battle, though, is already won. Bye-bye, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Your grand chessboard hegemonic dream is over. So there is a change. It's not being reported. Our analysts aren't talking about it in U.S. news. But a lot of smart people around the world and in this country are. It's just not on your TV set, and it's not on a lot of radio stations. Another good reason to support KYRS. But be sure that this is not the story our masters will tell us. We're going to hear of Hitlers and Stalins. We're going to hear of terrorists. And we will never once remember that the terrorists are of our own making and that the real Hitlers usually work for us. This has been Long Waves Radio with Gary Crook. Thank you so much for joining me today. You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. You can write me here at KYRS, longwaves at kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio. And you can find the podcasts are linked from the Facebook page, or simply search on YouTube, in quotes, I'll get it right in a minute, Long Waves Radio, in quotes, on YouTube. You'll turn over the podcasts. Thank you again for listening. Until next week, I'm out of here.